Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy is launching his crypto policy framework called the Three Freedoms of Crypto. The political newcomer, who is a former biotech executive, says the new proposals will unshackle American innovators from the administrative state. Vivek joins us now. Welcome to the show.
And how are you?
I'm great, thank you. Now, this new crypto framework is out. I got to ask you, if you become president of the United States, what changes from a crypto perspective?
I think what changes is that regulation by enforcement ends. What does that mean? That the rules are delineated clearly in advance, rather than you having to wait for an enforcement action for the SEC to figure out whether or not a given coin was a security or not, that Gary Gensler refuses to say today, for example, about Ethereum. What also changes is that any unconstitutional regulation, not just as it affects crypto, this is part of a broader administrative state reform for me, but any regulation that Congress did not expressly give an agency the power to pass is null and void. It turns out that applies to most regulations governing the crypto industry. And I put these into three categories for the areas of reform that I've laid out. One is the freedom to code. It's my view that code is speech. And while it's perfectly appropriate for the government to go after bad actors, if you take the Tornado Cash example, going upstream for the actual developers of the code, that's wrong. You got to draw the distinction between the code itself, which is protected, versus people who misuse it to steal. That's something that's not happening today. That's freedom of speech is principle number one. It's the freedom to code. Principle number two is financial self-reliance. I'll give you the punchline here. There's a lot that's behind it. I mean, the AML statutes, the Know Your Customer stuff, a lot of this, the Bank Secrecy Act, has been weaponized. But the punchline is self-hosted wallets should not be touched. I mean, that's part of the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian vision of financial self-reliance and independence. We can't have a regulatory apparatus that effectively creates self-hosted wallets and prevents them from actually being able to exist. So that's point number two. And then point number three is just the freedom to innovate. And I say this as somebody who comes from multiple different regulated industries in the past. The wet blanket on American innovation isn't even Congress. It's the regulatory state that's making up its own rules, regardless of the laws that actually exist in this country. And so we'll rescind all of those unconstitutional federal regulations. We'll downsize the federal employee headcount by 75%, which I think is a good thing. A lot of these toxic regulation and enforcement action come from the fact that if you have a bunch of people showing up to work who shouldn't have had that job in the first place, they find things to do. We'll put an end to that. And the good news about all of this is these are things I can get done as the U.S. president without asking Congress for permission or for forgiveness, because this relates to the executive branch of the government. And as the chief executive, I get to run that.
You mentioned a lot of points there I want to touch on. The first is clear legislation from Congress. You know, we've seen Congress not move on crypto legislation at all this year. It's looking unlikely that we'll get any by the end of the year. How does that actually change under you as the president of the United States? How will you incentivize Congress to actually move forward on some of these crypto legislation when there seems to be a lot more pressing things going on?
Well, I think that I believe in frankness here. I mean, the easy thing to say, we'll get this or that done through Congress. I can't make those promises about Congress. But the promises I can make are about what runs through the executive branch of the government, the three-letter agencies. So a lot of the enforcement actions, here's what I can do. Any regulation that's being applied outside of the scope of what Congress itself authorized the SEC, for example, to do, will cease enforcement action. And we will rescind those regulations that are themselves hampering innovation and, I would say, just basic functioning of the crypto sector more broadly. And so that's something I can do. And there's a Supreme Court case that came out last year, so this is relatively recent, that empowers me to do it. That's West Virginia versus EPA. And for people who are interested in this, I'd encourage you to take a look at that. That was a case that found that the regulations issued by the EPA on the coal industry, they were unconstitutional because Congress never gave the EPA that authority. And what the Supreme Court says is if this has an economic impact of $2,000 per person, well, that's enough to say it's a major question that Congress has to act on, not a regulatory agency. If that's the case for the EPA, that's absolutely the case for the SEC today as well. And so my view is I can drive a lot of that change through the administrative state that reports into the U.S. president. We're going to have clarity on what counts as a security or not. not deciding after the fact like a game of musical chairs to see who's left standing. Forget that. Regulatory clarity across the SEC and the CFTC out of the gate. That's a big part of what we're missing today is clarity from our regulators. What we're going to have is rescinding any of those regulations that are allowing the regulatory state to go after perfectly legal behavior, but by claiming that somehow it shouldn't exist because they don't like it. All of that can end on my watch without going through Congress in the first place. Respect for the First Amendment. Code is speech. So if you want to go after a bad actor who's robbing somebody of their property, fine. But you can't go after somebody just for writing code, for being the developer that creates a framework or system of rails that the government doesn't like when they wake up on the wrong side of their bed on a given day. Any regulation impeding self-hosted wallets as well, rescinded on day one. So that much I can do without having to go through the morass of Congress.
I want to turn to something you mentioned at the top of this segment is the reduction in federal workforce by 75%. You said that the SEC would be included in that. I think the SEC would probably argue that if they had more resources, more headcount, catastrophes like FTX might not have happened. How would you respond to that?
I think it's the inverse. I think that what we've had is actually an SEC, and it's not just the SEC. I want people to understand this. This is an example of what you see across the administrative state, from the FDA to the FTC to the EPA. But as it applies to this particular sector that we're having a conversation about, it's the SEC. A big part of the problem is there's no accountability when you have a proliferating cancer of federal employees. I mean, 25% of the people get 90% of the work done almost in any organization. It's definitely true in the U.S. government. What I've said is on day one, we would fire 50% of the federal employees across the board. And one of the things that stopped prior presidents from doing it is the so-called civil service protections, or the rules that say you can't fire individual employees or else they could sue you for years, claiming that it was political discrimination, claiming that it was civil rights violations or otherwise. And this is why other presidents don't touch this. Well, and I understand the law of large numbers here. Large numbers apply to the federal government. I've even given a thought experiment of how you could do it in a way that avoids the civil service rules. Literally make sure that it is random in the first instance. Use a chainsaw. A chisel can come later, but start with a chainsaw. You could even do a thought experiment if your social security number ends in an odd number. You're out on day one. That actually, ironically, follows the civil service rules because there's no individual political retaliation or retribution that a given civil servant can allege. And then that actually increases the accountability of the people who are left there. So I reject this argument that it's a resourcing problem. To the contrary, the government's actually been far more effective at points in our history when it's been far smaller. But what it is a clarity issue. And when you have people taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to Congress, Congress is the one that should be making the laws, not these administrative agencies. Part of being overstaffed is they then start to take on responsibilities that those agencies should not have had in the first place. So I stand for accountability, and this will be a step forward in the direction of government accountability.
You know, if I compare what you're saying to the private sector, when you cut 75% of staff, I've seen in companies that I've been in that does that. The morale is down. You can't really get anything done. It's very tough to implement any kind of new plan. How do you think that this new plan can be executed properly by cutting so much staff and taking away those resources?
Well, there's a lot of differences between the government and the private sector. And I've been, I've been CEO of companies, have built multi-billion-dollar business from scratch. So I understand, what you're referring to. I think public service needs to go back to being about public service, actually. I also favor 8-year term limits in that bureaucracy for most positions. Think about someone like myself. If I'm running for U.S. president and I can't work for the American taxpayer for more than 8 years, which I think is a good thing, then it doesn't make sense that many of those federal bureaucrats reporting into me get comfortable in their positions either. We need to restore that sense of public service. And I think that what happens over time is people get overly accustomed to exercising undue power or control. And there starts to become a culture of envy, frankly, if we're talking really honestly here. That's what you have, is people who aren't particularly paid well in those positions that begin to have envy for those who may be innovating in the private sector or otherwise, but they're channeling then that angst and that anger through the overreach of the regulatory state in ways that are unconstitutional. That needs to end. Now, my view is it's not just the downsizing. I'll take a private sector lesson from here. I think government employees who are the top 25% of performers should be able to have variable pay, bonuses or otherwise, that reflect good performance according to pre-existing metrics of what success looks like. So yes, I think part of the problem is if it were a private company or it were a company in the private sector, we would have never gotten to the place we are in this cancerous proliferation of the number of bureaucrats. The private sector doesn't have civil service protections that say a CEO can't fire somebody, period, working in that organization, no matter what they do. Well, that's a big part of the reason why we have to be able and willing to take steps that, if they don't sound like extreme steps in terms of reducing the size and scope of the federal regulations and the number of federal bureaucrats, then it means a candidate isn't really serious about doing it, because the status quo is extreme. The status quo is unmanageable. It is unwieldy. 3 million civil service federal employees alone. I think that is a disservice to the American people. It's a formula for corruption. It's a formula for regulatory overreach. And frankly, sectors like yours, you're not the only one, the energy sector included, healthcare sector included, but your sector is especially among those that are affected by it. And America suffers as a result, when this should be the most innovative space on God's green earth. We're the land of our founding fathers, the pioneers, the explorers, people who believed in free expression, financial self-reliance. I think people who would be staunchly in favor of the rise of alternative competing models to the existing financial system. I think they'd be cryptocurrency fans if they were alive today, frankly. Decentralization baked into the Constitution. The 10th Amendment that says that which does not belong to the federal government belongs to the states and to the people. That's decentralization baked into our Constitution. But what we see today is a concentration of power that's a violation of that. And I think a big part of the problem is the proliferation of the size of that bureaucracy. That I can shut down and rein in as the US president without having to run through Congress. That's what it takes a strong chief executive to do, and that's why I'm running for this office.
All right, Vivek, under your new framework, how do you plan to protect the American citizens against scams, hacks? This industry, as you know, is rife with scams and hacks. People lose a lot of money interacting with some of these DeFi protocols, and often it's said is because there's no clear regulation. How are you protecting the American citizen under this new framework?
Enforce the existing laws as they exist on the books for other types of property. I don't think that we need to reinvent the rules for something, for an asset just because it happens to be a digital asset, right? Let's say you store your passwords on a USB stick. Fine. You know, if that's financial self-reliance, that's self-hosting, you could call it. If somebody comes in and steals that from you, there's no different set of rules because that happens to deal with crypto. They stole something that belongs into you. So somebody breaks into your house, steals that. That's theft just as it was the old way. And so I think we confound our understanding by creating a governmental overreach that's particularly hostile to crypto. I mean, think about the Biden administration's proposed rules to say that if you use energy for Bitcoin mining or electricity for Bitcoin mining, there's a 30% excise tax on that. That's what you open the door to when you try to create new sets of rules, when in fact, it's the old school principles. Theft is wrong. We will punish it the same way. Any other crime of violating somebody else's property right. We've dealt with this before with the advent of the internet, with the advent of email, with the advent of the telephone. We've applied the same principles at every step, and I think we should do the same thing here. And if we start to create some sort of specialized set of enforcement actions just because you happen to be innovating in the sector of crypto, I think that is a formula for government overreach. So the answer is enforce the laws as they already exist on the books in an even-handed way, protect property rights, protect the basic rights that we already enshrine, go after bad actors in that existing framework rather than the developers of code. That's the right answer.
Well, then I guess I got to ask you about the Howey test. The SEC has been staunch in that the Howey test is able to determine whether any crypto asset is a commodity or a security. It has existed for almost 100 years. What's your litmus test for deciding if something's a security or commodity? Do you think the Howey test is the right tool to be using?
Well, if it was that clear, I think Gary Gensler should have been able to give a clear answer of whether Ethereum counts as a security or not. When he's testifying before Congress, he couldn't offer that clear answer. And I think part of the reason why is that ambiguity is the friend of the tyrant. Ambiguity is the friend of the bureaucrat. This same agency, the SEC, if you want to rewind long before the existence of crypto, they actually, when the Congress was considering clearer rules on what counts as insider trading or not, the number one agency lobbying Congress for not providing that clarity was none other than the SEC. So my view is, whatever it is, I'll give you what my view should be, what my view is, but whether it's my view or somebody else's, we need clarity. And a litmus test of whether or not you have a good litmus test is, should you be able to say for widely used forms of traded currency like Ethereum or otherwise, you should be able to say, everyone should know, does that fall under a securities regulation paradigm or not? And the fact that the current leader of the SEC could not offer that clear answer, even for something as widely used and known as Ethereum, says that the current framework fails. Here's my view. If you have an issuer, right, securities laws exist in the framework of companies that issue securities to raise money. Companies can decide. It's individuals who make a decision of whether or not to issue more. That's a discretionary decision made by individuals, a board of directors or otherwise. And if there's a supply that can continue to be issued, that's a good example of what counts as a security. That's what the securities laws were intended to police. So on the other hand, if you have something like Bitcoin, fits that description, it's on the other side of that, it's crystal clear. It's a fixed supply. There's no human discretionary decision of whether to issue more or not. That's not a security. Now, I would say, again, use the securities laws that are already on the books. My view is that most forms of cryptocurrency should be in the category of commodities, not securities. They fail the test of what securities were all about in the first place. But whatever the rules of the road are, they deserve to be clear. And my litmus test of whether or not they're clear is if the head of the SEC or the commissioners of the SEC cannot instantly answer whether or not some widely used cryptocurrency or coin counts as a security or a commodity, that means the rules that we have right now are a failure. That's exactly where we are today.
Vivek,
so my answer would be on the side of commodities.
We're just about out of time. I want to quickly get your thoughts here. If you can eliminate the SEC, who would your top candidates be for SEC chair?
So look, I think that we're actually in the process of releasing in the first quarter of next year our staffing plans across the federal government. What I will say is that it should be somebody who shares my fundamental skepticism of bureaucracy in the federal government and of unconstitutional rulemaking. That will likely be someone coming from outside of government, someone who has come from a regulated industry and understands the unintended costs of regulation. I think many of the people who work at the SEC are good people, but don't understand what the unintended consequences are for American innovation. And people who have been on the other side of that do. So I think it will likely be for somebody, when it comes to the FDA or the SEC or otherwise, let's talk about the SEC, someone who's been on the receiving end of those regulations, who understands the importance of making sure that we're protecting Americans against theft or defrauding. And yes, understand that those are laws on the books that exist for a reason, but also understand what the unintended consequences of regulatory overreach are, how that shackles American innovation. That would be the kind of candidate who would be a good chief commissioner of the SEC. And also, quite importantly, somebody who is willing to effectuate large-scale headcount reductions and large-scale rescinding of regulations, and who's willing to understand that if I, as the U.S. president, swear an oath to the Constitution, and the Supreme Court agrees with me that many of those regulations are unconstitutional, we'll be willing to follow my mandate to make sure we're not enforcing those unconstitutional federal regulations starting on day one. And so that'll be the test that I use.
Any names come to mind?
I'm not going to share those names right now until we've thoroughly vetted them, but we're building a list and we expect to release them in the first quarter of next year across the federal government. I think that's something that's never been done for a presidential candidate. That'll happen in probably early Q1 across the board. And so we will provide clarity before I'm elected.
And Vivek, do you own any crypto?
I have before the presidential campaign started, and now my assets are managed independently, but I expect that hasn't changed. Bitcoin, Ethereum, otherwise, was absolutely part of my portfolio.
All right, Vivek, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That was U.S. presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy.